Welcome to episode 47 of the Empowering Ability Podcast.
Welcome to the Empowering Ability Podcast, where we get you and your loved ones impacted by disability the information needed to live a full and meaningful life. Now here's your host, Eric Gall.
Hey folks, welcome to the podcast. Happy to have you join us. Today's guest is Michael Kendrick, and Michael is a PhD, and he focuses his work as a consultant, a educator, and also does evaluative work with many different groups, governments, private agencies, advocacy groups, universities and college, community organizations, and really focused on consulting and training all around the area of disability. And Michael's done this internationally across many different countries, resides in the United States, originally from the East Coast of Canada. And I met Michael a couple of times, and I've taken some of his workshops and his training course called Optimal Individualized Service Design. That's a leadership level program really focused on understanding an individual's need and figuring out how to best meet that individual's need and coming up with an individualized plan for it. So if that's something that interests you, I recommend you trying to figure out where would be the closest point to participate in Michael's course. And he facilitates that globally. So there's likely an opportunity coming up in your area sometime in the near future. So today's podcast with Michael, we really focused in on answering a few questions and getting Michael's perspective on them. So I asked Michael how people with disabilities have lived, how are they living today, and what have we learned? In the podcast, I also asked Michael about Ontario, the province of Ontario in Canada's announcement around funding more group homes and group living, and get his opinion on that and why it's an ill-advised investment. Michael gives his perspective on that as well. And we talk about what Michael calls Enlightened Attentiveness. And that's what I've named this podcast. And I think it's a really important thing for all of us to consider and to think about how we can show up in that way. So without any further ado, here's Michael Kendrick. Hey, Michael, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to be speaking with you today. I've really enjoyed getting to know you over this past year, and definitely learned a lot from you, Michael. So excited to have this conversation with you today. And where I'd love to start our conversation is really just to explore and think through and talk about how people with disabilities have lived in the past, and I guess maybe where we've got up to today. And from that, maybe starting to talk through what we've learned about how people have lived and where we can, move and go forward with. So that's really the basis of the conversation that I would love today. But maybe if you'd be able to just start us off with your observations and thoughts around how people with disabilities have lived.
That's a very good question. And of course, they've lived under quite different circumstances depending on which point in history and which culture they were in. So it's not that all experiences of people with disabilities are identical. But what we are familiar with in terms of history, it's pretty clear that people with disabilities have been seen as somehow inferior or of less value, and that they have less capacity than their brothers and sisters, that they are more dependent, and so on. So in this sense, the people with disabilities have been seen in a largely more negative light by large numbers of people, not everyone, of course, but large numbers of people. And in fact, there has been many periods where people with disabilities were seen as not human, maybe somewhat human, but not really human like everybody else. And that has led to them being treated like they're less human than others. There was a time, for instance, when when people were getting medical procedures, they weren't given any kind of anesthetic on the presumption that they didn't feel pain. And again, of course, that's just now seems like a silly idea. But at that point, the presumption was that they are so different from everybody else that you just can't use the same assumptions. And so in many instances, people with disabilities would have had the experience of being not welcome even to be born. And so it's been quite widespread practice since abortion has become available to have people abort children with disabilities that are diagnosed in utero. And that's a very strong statement that they're unwanted. And that goes towards many other kinds of aspects of their life, that they might be seen as a burden on their families, on the society, that sort of thing. And that they are, if you like, possibly even dangerous in some unknown ways, but treated as if they are somehow a menace to other people, that they would be difficult with their brothers and sisters, or difficult in public, or things like this. Now, I don't want to itemize every sort of negative perception that has been there, but rather to point out that they live in a world of assumptions created by other people that have big impacts on what kind of life they get to live. And everyone is subject to assumptions about them. And assumptions can be of two kinds, really. They can be assumptions that liberate people to their true potentials, and assumptions that hold them back. For instance, if you think just in feminist terms, the assumption that women couldn't do this or that type of work or job had meant then that women just never really got the opportunity to show that they could work in different professions, different fields, and so on. And so the assumption that they couldn't do what men could do was a prejudicial assumption from where we sit today. But at the time, it wouldn't have been seen necessarily, particularly by men, as a prejudicial assumption. But from a different vantage point now, we can see that women dominate all professions other than really engineering. So a lot has changed that has changed our perception, and the prejudice against women persists, but it's a very different level of the evaluation of women than at other times. And so all human beings, are either constrained by assumptions or beliefs, mindsets, or they're liberated by them. And so what's in that mindset, what's in that assumption, is always something we should take the time to challenge if it doesn't seem to make sense. For instance, there was a time when people believed that people with disabilities couldn't work in open employment, in regular jobs in the community and so on. But now we have jurisdictions where 3 out of 4 people with disabilities are working at regular jobs in the community. There was a time when people believed that they couldn't be included in regular school classrooms. They needed to be in segregated school classrooms. Now we have ample examples of school and whole school systems that are premised on the idea that the students with disabilities ought to be in alongside their age peers in the regular classroom. So in each of these examples, you can see that a mind shift has taken place. And it has real consequences for the individual, and particularly when the individual with disability is allowed to live a more fuller life. Lo and behold, they do. And they benefit from a more full life, much as they are impoverished by limited opportunities. So the key thing is when we change our mind, we change our world. And maybe there are things about our mindsets towards people with disabilities that if we change them, it would be a net benefit to people with disabilities, that they would begin to develop life opportunities that they simply aren't having at the moment. So much of this has happened, the most radical transformations really that we can find in history in terms of these mindsets have really been the last 2.5 generations, initially in the Western societies, but has spread quite widely now into many other societies, and increased support for people with disabilities as being treated as equal to other people, and to having a life like other people. And the original concept was borrowed from Sweden and Denmark, which was the normalization principle, which was actually created by family advocates in the Nordic countries. And the premise was that the people with disabilities ought to be treated like everybody else and to have as normal a life as possible. Later on, it was sort of made into a more sophisticated version of that called social role valorization, which is really that when people are valued and given valued social roles, they will prosper. And so it's an extension of the normalization principle. And that thinking has pushed its way into almost everything you could think of in terms of the lives of people with disabilities. And this has quite beneficial effects. But what it has not done has entirely transformed the lives of people with disabilities. It has radically transformed their lives, but we have persistent prejudicial assumptions about people with disabilities that have not gone away. And so while we've had great advances, we still face often quite grim realities. Just one small statistic, and that is that people with disabilities are more likely to be exploited than many other groups in society. They're 2.5 times more likely to be victims of crime, for instance. So in many of these things that you can actually measure, life is still pretty tough for people with disabilities and very unfair. And some of it may go unreported and unrecorded. So that's just I'm saying that based on what we have by way of recorded information. There may be many things that we don't appreciate fully enough at the moment because we simply aren't paying enough attention to them or don't have the data. But so where am I going with all this is really that life will get better for people with disabilities when we pay attention to what's going on in our minds and to begin to shift our perspectives and conclusions and assumptions. For instance, if you don't get to be born, you don't have a very good life. And so I'm always concerned about the fact that people with disabilities that people choose not to have the child be born. And having met countless numbers of people with disabilities, I think people with disabilities are better for society than many of the people that are valued in society. For instance, I think many of the corrupt industries and vested interests in society do more to damage society than anything people with disabilities could do. And so I actually enjoy the company of people with disabilities. I'm grateful for their presence, and I've learned to appreciate them as individuals, one person at a time. And I don't think that everyone gets that opportunity.
I think that's a great
summary. But when they do, they often, it's a revelation to them just how much they'd underestimated people with disabilities and what they can do with their lives, how interesting they are as people, surrounding them, and how things like that. So in some sense, mindsets have opening up our minds may be a bit of a revelation for us. We may just shift in many ways that we would never thought possible in terms of how we now might see people with disabilities.
Society shifting their beliefs more towards that normalization for people with disabilities. And I want to get your thoughts on this, on I guess where we are today and the work that still needs to be done, because I think that those limiting beliefs that are still held by people in society are holding people with disabilities back, or are holding them as hostages. And I'm stealing that language from you that I've heard you use in some of your teachings. So, and part of this is, examples would be segregated environments. So, things that are created that are special, or segregated living situations such as institutions. Could you speak to a little bit about those things, Michael, and how those beliefs and those systems, those structures are holding people back and holding people with disabilities hostage?
Yeah, it's kind of logical that when people define somebody as not like us or not us, then having them with us seems counter intuitive, or counter what you would want. And so it leads to the rejection of people and a choice not to have people with us. And that creates then the question of, if they're not with us, then where are they? Well, they're somewhere else. So what we do is we create a somewhere else for people with disabilities that is typically a place where we congregate people that are believed to not be desirable to have with us. And then we claim things like, well, they'd be happier with their own kind, and their own kind is disabled. And so we will then congregate disabled people somewhere away from us. And the institutions of recent memory were the most obvious and visible example of that. But even in everyday life today, you'll see segregation of people with disabilities in terms of things like Special Olympics is a good example of sports for them rather than sports with us. And another good example of segregation would be, of course, segregated schools or segregated classrooms, or segregated leisure opportunities of one kind or another. And segregated housing would be another, and segregated employment. And you could go on. There seems to be no limit to the ways in which we can have people away from us. Now, it's justified by people as saying, well, they wouldn't fit in with ordinary people in ordinary situations, which is a belief. It's not fact, but it's a belief. And therefore, they would be happier and a better fit to be with people like themselves. Now, what's good about the times we live in is people have questioned that belief. And of course, we now see examples of people with disabilities included everywhere. You see the people with disabilities in if you on public transport, you'll see people with disabilities. You'll see people with disabilities in the shopping center. See people with disabilities watching a sporting event. You see people with disabilities at movie theaters. You'll see people with disabilities next to you when you're at the dentist. And so in every element of ordinary life, you'll see increasing presence of people with disabilities, rather than the only time you'd see them would be off in some separate place reserved for them. And in many ways, that separateness may be based on fear of people with disabilities, that if they were with us, some terrible thing might happen, And I was reminded of this. I was in South Korea doing some work, and I managed to visit an old leper colony on an island in the south of South Korea. And it was very interesting because people were afraid of people with leprosy for good reason. They had a disease that you could catch. And so they were, in that instance, you could see a certain logic in keeping them separate. And when their family came to see them, there was a huge road into the place, and the people with leprosy would be on one side, and the families would be on the other side of the road, and they'd talk to each other across a space of 3 or 4 meters, whatever the width of the road was. And there, you can see fear play itself out, because fear, in that sense, had a rational basis. Now, in the case of people with disabilities, you can still have fear, but it isn't necessarily irrational. So you have irrational fear or outlooks towards people with disabilities that somehow it will be bad if they're with us. And so that's a theory, if you like, a proposal. And it's a testable proposal, because all you need to do to test it is to see what happens with people with disabilities when they are included. And I'm happy to testify that the walls did not fall down. The sky is still there. The sun rises in the morning. People get along with each other. And people with disabilities, even if they've never had much social contact, quickly learn what the proper rules of behavior are, and so on. And so people adjust to them, and they adjust to the people around them. And thankfully, we now have many families that have included their family member in every aspect of family life and community life. And lo and behold, they do just fine. And all of these myths that, somehow being with other people would either damage them or damage other people is proved to be a complete falsehood. Now, I will say this, though, that there are issues that come up in everyday community encounters between people with disabilities and others. And people with disabilities may, from time to time, misstep or misbehave just like the rest of us. So it's better to think of inclusion as being that it works better when people get support to be successful in the inclusive context. And we all need a bit of support to be successful, particularly when we're in new kinds of gatherings or social contexts, because we may not know what the proper behavior is in those contexts. And
recently
so
I saw you
a bit of coaching
a letter
or
that you
assistance.
wrote And it was,
can be very
I
helpful
believe, specifically
as to getting off on the right foot.
Response or regard to
So
government investment in
but even if you don't get off on the right foot,
institutionalized settings.
it's not the end of the world.
In Ontario,
these things, you can pick up the pieces
it's looking
usually.
like there's government money that's going to be invested in building.
I guess the takeaway from that is that
why is that
it's a
the
myth
best idea?
that people with disabilities can't succeed in inclusive settings. Okay, well, a couple of things about this. First of all, group homes are based on the premise that people with disabilities should live with each other, and that they would always be compatible and whatnot. And that's simply nonsensical, that people should choose to live with people because they have something in common with them besides a disability. And so from an everyday standard of, if you think, well, who am I going to live with? If I'm going to live with others and I have to share the rent or something, I'm going to choose to live with people I'm compatible with. And so group homes really have a history of putting people together to live together that are incompatible. And that creates not just the problem of segregation, but also if you like, a kind of misfit of people being forced to live with each other who aren't choosing to do it. It's involuntary. It's forced shared living. But it's also can be quite upsetting for people because it creates very often a very stressful existence for people. So that's just on the personal kind of level for the person. Secondly, it creates the idea that that's the only option for people with disabilities. When in fact we have provinces like Newfoundland that back in the beginning when they're just introducing group homes in Canada, they decided they weren't going to do group homes. They were going to have other living arrangements for people that are more inclusive and more individualized. And they've never had to do group homes. So the Ontario premise that the only option or the best option is group homes is, I think, quite questionable. And I think personally, from my own experience, having evaluated the services in multiple countries and looked at the actual story of people's lives many times over, I find the individualized one person at a time arrangements much better for people because it gives you not just one choice, it gives you thousands of different choices in terms of finding a living arrangement that suits you, because there are many different living arrangements besides group homes. And it doesn't mean that if you don't live in a group home, you're going to live alone in an apartment. That you can live alone in an apartment. Some people prefer that. But you can also have a housemate that isn't a disabled person. You could join in with a few people your own age and get a bigger house. No matter where people with disabilities live from a housing point of view, whatever setting. For instance, there are people with disabilities that own their own home because they were fortunate enough to have a family that helped them acquire a home of their own that they owned, but many rent. It's also true that many people with disabilities might, over a period of time, live in a number of different arrangements, like everybody else, that as your life circumstances change, you might change your living arrangement. And so many of these people, I've been part of many exercises to create alternatives to group homes, and it's quite doable. And it's already been done in Ontario. So the idea that the government should decide on a single option as being crucial, as sort of the backbone of their residential support system, I think is very short-sighted. And I think group homes are really mini institutional. And they were one of the best ideas of the 1970s, but now we're almost a half century later, and we need to move our thinking along. And the group home is not at the leading edge of options for people. The more personalized, one person at a time arrangements are infinitely better qualitatively. So I think the government of Ontario is being held hostage to a dying service model, in a sense, a model that should go away and be replaced by more up-to-date options. And I don't mean to pick on the government of Ontario, because there'd be group homes in many jurisdictions, but it's also the case that in many places governments have chosen to expand their individualized options and freeze the growth of segregated congregate options like group homes. For instance, that's what's happened in Vermont, and it's happened for instance, in the Australian context by essentially giving people the individual funding to create one person at a time arrangements if that's what they want. So I don't think from a technical point of view that it's all that difficult to create more individualized options, but both the service providers and the government of Ontario seem convinced that that's the case, and I think history will show that they were deeply misguided in doing so. And it also revealed that they were told this.
So
in this conversation, that they were misguided, and they've chosen to ignore that
people with disabilities
advice. So I think, in this sense, history will have a lot to judge them on in terms of how they've missed a great opportunity in 2018 to put an end to segregation, freeze it, and to scale back the group homes, and if you like, grow the more individualized, more socially inclusive,
of normalization,
more if you like, tailor-made options.
And the benefits of
so yeah, that would be my view.
To live more normative lives and to build their identities, which will help to build relationships with others. Michael, is there anything else that you want to add to the question of what have we learned and what would be a benefit to carry forward?
Well, I think a very important thing we've learned is that we've been much too conservative, too cautious, too pessimistic about the true potentials of people with disabilities. We've almost always had too low expectations for what people could do with their lives. So the takeaway lesson from that, if you like, that our fallback position is always a pessimistic one, is that we have to be more self-consciously optimistic about people with disabilities, make much more presumptions in a positive direction about their capacities, about their adaptive abilities, and about their life potentials than we've been doing. Now, it's not to criticize people because they've been pessimistic, but rather to point out that the issue isn't people with disabilities, it's the pessimism about people with disabilities that's the problem. Because people with disabilities, when the opportunities are provided, when the support is there to take advantage of the opportunities, generally exceed expectations. And even though in the process many people with disabilities have a big learning curve, they do learn and they do adapt. And that's why we now have jurisdictions where 3 out of 4 people with disabilities are working in regular jobs, in regular places in the community, when for years, decades, centuries possibly, people just never thought they could do that. And so if we were wrong in being so pessimistic, we're probably going to be wrong again. And so we need a new reflex, if you like, which would be the reflex of positive presumption. We should just presume that we are being
There's a quote
much
that you shared in the
pessimistic,
optimal individualized service design,
and have a reflex, almost develop a reflex to start questioning ourselves.
So just to share back the quote,
giving people with disabilities the benefit of the doubt,
an individual as they are,
prejudging
they will stay
them
as they are.
as
if you
not
treat people
being able
as
to
they could
adapt or be successful,
they will become what they ought to be.
So the issue isn't really them. The issue is the mindset of people like myself and others that have created as you've used the term hostage, that they become a hostage to our low expectations. Yeah, it's a great quote, and and that of course was written. I think that was Goethe that may have said that originally.
So for
but that was written really as a universal
that might be
principle.
Listening to this conversation, to supporters that are listening,
if the same thing was applied to any of us, we'd probably end up with the same misfortunes as people with disabilities have.
High expectations.
And again, you can see that
people with disabilities. How do
you
we
see the racism
support them
and how
to be
people treat
human?
people from different races
how do we change
as if they
cultural perceptions
aren't what they could be, and therefore never get the opportunities to show what they could be. So it's a universal
these are some big questions,
but it
but
also
are there
applies
any
to people with
any
disabilities
tools,
as well.
any concepts that are coming to mind that people can practically and tangibly take and act on?
Yes, there would be. I think there are many people that would have pointed out that we all human beings are profoundly alike in our essence, and that people with disabilities aren't subhuman or less than human. They're as fully human as any other human being. And in that sense, the principle should be the deep respect for the full humanity of people with disabilities. And so in this sense, the implication is that if something benefits the rest of the world, it will benefit people with disabilities as well. And again, when we deprive people with disabilities of benefits that come from community and from society, then we are essentially undermining their ability as human beings to live fully. And we are, in a sense, damaging people with disabilities. So that's sort of the principle. But one of the applications comes from social role valorization theory, which is the concept of the culturally valued analog. And that may be a term that's completely unfamiliar to people, but what it means essentially is we should always, with people with disabilities, provide to them the same options that the rest of us who are more valued in society potentially have available to us. So we should always do the normal thing and make the normal thing available to people with disabilities just almost on principle, because if it's good for everybody else, it's good for people with disabilities to have access to whatever that might be. And For instance, we now see examples, for instance, of people with disabilities having the same hobbies as other people, the same sort of pastimes, things that for instance, I was in Australia one time, met a man with Down syndrome. His father was a martial arts instructor, and the son had become a black belt in some kind of martial arts. I can't remember what it was, but I think it was Taekwondo. And it's not like everybody with disability wants to become a martial arts instructor or high level. But if it were of interest to them, why not give them the chance to see if that really is something they'd like to do? So in this sense, people with disabilities, when they get the same opportunities, the culturally valued analog, they often find it's something that does suit them. And so their life expands accordingly. And so you could have, people with disabilities be very good with a particular musical instrument, or they could be very good at a particular type of work, or they could find that they're really into gardening, or that they really like Asian cooking. So all of the things that others might enjoy, it's conceivable that a person with a disability might enjoy them and become proficient in them. So in this sense, where we've had great everyday progress, and this would be very important for families, is just to don't judge ahead of time that something won't work with a person with a disability, but rather keep an open mind and see if you can include the person with disability in an experience that others from time to time enjoy, and see what people ultimately do, make their niches in life. So in this sense, the culturally valued analog is that every human being kind of creates the life that suits them best, if they can do it. And that's the principle that we should have with people with disabilities, that each should have an opportunity to build an interesting life for themselves that's satisfying and fulfilling. And that's why the more individualized options are going to be so much better, because you're not putting everybody into the same size shoe.
Yeah,
you're
so
saying
giving people
every
the same
person's a little bit different from the next
anybody
one.
else would have, and starting
And so everybody
with
needs their own
what
sort of
is
individual
valued in,
path
in our
in
culture,
life.
in our society, and
And
starting
again, that's
with
why
what
I find it regressive
option
to
is for
have people with
everybody,
disabilities being given
instead
the
of
same living option,
jumping
like
to
group homes
the special option.
or anything
And
that
we're thinking about what that culturally valued analog
is
is. What is that
non-individualized,
normal
because
conversation
the rest
like
of us insist on
for anybody?
being able to
starting
chart our own course in
there.
life and to shape our
One of
lives
the things
in every
that I've heard you
detail,
speak
really.
about, Michael, is people with disabilities haven't had a lot of, some people with disabilities haven't had a lot of experiences, or they haven't had a lot of opportunities. So they might not exactly know what they might like. So for an individual like that, what would you say to them?
Well, it's quite possible that people may have been deprived of opportunities, for often in the old days, it used to be for a very long period of time. But what we learned from all that is that if that's been the case, that people have not had many opportunities, the solution is quite clear, which is start creating some new opportunities and make up for the difference. And if you're wondering, well, is it too late? It's never too late to try to get a different taste of life and life opportunities. And so we've seen many people with disabilities have been held back for decades, that once they had the opportunities, they quickly, almost in a sense, became a different person, because they now could live in such a different way and have gone on to thrive in new lives. So even though they look deprived and have been deprived, that is overcomable. It has its persisting effects, of course, but if people quickly, you could imagine if life starts getting good, people aren't going to complain a whole lot. It typically is a welcome change for people to have their life fill up with interesting things to do and new experiences. The caution would be to do it at the pace that the individual wants to do it, and rather than
with families,
some kind of forced march towards a good life, almost like it'd be better to do an exploratory life tasting kind of journey of a little of this, a little of that, and see what sticks really in terms of what the person really is drawn to.
Do that,
but again,
whatever that thing,
the whole thing is quite feasible and quite realistic. That even if you've been held back, you can make up for it later.
Mindsets that we can
simply
take to
by
avoid
adding new opportunities
into that
and
trap.
experiences and supporting people.
And I guess for me, where this also comes into play is really around autonomy and decision making. So the assumption being made that that individual with a disability doesn't have the capability to make that kind of a decision, or they can't, they're not able to take that level of responsibility. Can you share your thoughts around those topics?
Yeah, this is again part of that thinking that their disability means that they have no capacity at all. Whereas a more true appraisal of all of us is that we all lack capacities of one kind or another to some degree. And people with disabilities may or may not have unlimited capacity, but they certainly have capacity. And the presumption should always be, particularly around their own decision making, that they can make decisions on their own behalf. And it's better that they do that because they will learn how to make good decisions, and they will experience the consequences of decisions that didn't turn out to be so good. Like everybody else, it's how you learn about decision making, is making decisions and practicing decision making, and so you can then support and safeguard people in terms of their vulnerabilities in such instances. And so we have, the phenomena really of what's called supported decision making, which is just based on the premise that people should be the decision maker in their own life, but they'll do better with that if they're supported, and so they can pick their own supporters and to help them with areas of decision making that they find challenging. And so a lot of this is really getting the right supports in place that allow the person to stay the decision maker in their life, but to manage the ups and downs that come with the decisions. And so all of us get support with decisions constantly. We don't notice that we're getting it, but we talk to people all the time about, should I do this, or should I buy that, or we consult others and benefit from the support of others on decisions. And sometimes we should have consulted with others on some decisions and didn't. And we would have done better to have gotten some advice. So be that as it may, supporting people isn't an unnatural thing to do. It's actually a sensible kind of strategy. So people with disabilities typically rebel against not being able to be decision makers because they feel things are done to them and on them and at them rather than with them. And so it often provokes them into oppositional behavior because people are running around deciding for them when they themselves should be the person that's deciding things in their own life. And so you could see why they feel affronted by people controlling them and doing things to them without their permission and so on. So you also tend to have people that are easier to get along with when they become much more the decision maker in their life, because they feel they don't feel that people are a threat anymore, because they're not losing their decision making, and therefore people aren't taking something away from them. People are there in a very supportive way to them and with them, and so therefore a lot of behavioral issues kind of disappear that are related to this underlying loss of autonomy that's been imposed upon them. Now, that's not to say that people with disabilities will make good decisions in every instance. So it is important, almost it would be neglectful to not support people if one can do it, even when they don't ask for it. So in other words, there may be times where the person with a disability won't be willing to take support or ask for it. And I think there are times where people can intervene and speak to the person even though they weren't asked to. But it has to be done quite respectfully, as it would with any of us if somebody stuck their nose in our business. But I think people that are concerned about us ought to be able to say to us,
make a lot of really good
I'm concerned
points there,
about decision X or
I think
Y.
It's really good that you pointed out that
it's still your decision to make, but this were some thoughts I had, and apologize for interfering,
quite
but
as
I'm
obvious
just concerned that you get good outcomes or whatever.
Bigger things in life.
So in that sense, you're not giving up the ability to influence the individual, but you are giving up the control of the individual.
With our partner, maybe our parents,
so I think that's an important distinction, the ability to influence versus
many instances
control
where
them.
we are seeking that support for our decisions. One of the things that I've seen as a valuable structure for individuals with disabilities is a support circle. So, Michael, could you just briefly at a high level describe what a support circle is for those listeners that this might be a new concept, and how that could be of benefit to an individual with a disability?
Yeah, an intentional support circle or network is a mechanism that's emerged quite some time ago now, but it really is something that just mimics what happens in most people's life, that you draw people around you who could be helpful. And that's where the intentionality comes, that you draw the people that are intentionally helpful at that time with the issues that may be present at that time. And so in this sense, a couple of things about these networks. The networks exist to solve different issues, though. So a support circle isn't the kind of generic all-purpose support circle. Typically is really there to kind of engage the issues that are important for that particular person at that particular time. So, for instance, if a person was moving out of the family home, getting their own place, transitioning into adulthood, then you'd be dealing with the sort of whatever support they need with that process. But if you were dealing with an individual that had some very serious health issues to manage, but wanted to live independently, then you'd be dealing with, well, how can we help the person with those challenges and help preserve their independence. So it'd be a different kind of focus. And other support circles, maybe they're more for social purposes, that the person really likes people and likes relationships and again, really needs an inner network in their life. So that support circle would have a quite different
individualized and personalized
composition, probably, and also purpose.
And everybody's
so in that sense, you could think of support circles as something you can tailor
no exception
to a particular person, and they may not need to
Michael,
exist forever in their life. It may be at a particular time a support circle be helpful. At another time, it might be a bit more superfluous.
Is there a message
because the issues
or a challenge
aren't there
that
anymore.
you would like to leave with the listeners?
Yeah, I think a very important challenge that I feel in my own life constantly with people with disabilities is to give them quality attention when you're with them. And if you like, that if you pay attention to people, a lot of things about people and their lives will become more clear to you. And in this sense, I think if we could only do one thing in life to be supportive of people with disabilities, it would be to pay attention, to let us get instructed by them simply by knowing the person and getting to know them better, but to be really attentive to learning who they are and what their life is like. In this sense, we don't know where that will take us, but it will certainly raise our consciousness and change us, and for the better. And I think one great shortcoming all of us have is we simply don't take people with disabilities seriously enough. And I think the antidote to that is I don't know what you'd call it, but I'd say enlightened
Michael, is there
attentiveness.
Somewhere that folks listening can
to the
go
person
to
and let it go where
learn
it goes?
more about
you don't know what
some of the writings
will
that you
come of
have
it,
done,
but I think
or
it's the most deeply respectful thing we can do
our conversation
is
today.
to pay attention to a human being with an eagerness to be made different by paying attention. That we will be enlightened in ways that we aren't if we ignore the person. Yes, I do have a website, but it's actually being worked on at the moment in Australia. And so it's not online, but my material's on a lot of other people's websites and whatnot. I've got YouTube videos, various things. So I think if you just, if people were to Google just Michael Kendrick or Michael Kendrick Consulting, you'll get drawn to many different websites, and then on those websites there'll be additional links.
Okay. Awesome. Well, Michael,
and that's just for
really appreciate
me, but many of these other websites have other interesting people and things on them that might be a whole lot better than anything I could offer. So if people don't mind doing that, Googling, that's for the moment, that would be best. I probably have something like 150 publications, and they're, I put all those things on the internet in the event that they might be helpful to somebody. So they're sitting on a lot of websites, so it shouldn't be too hard to find them. Well, be grateful. I'm grateful to be part of it, and I'm so grateful that people like you are doing these podcasts. It's so helpful. So my compliments. Okay, thanks.
A big thank you to Michael Kendrick for coming on the podcast today and sharing his insights and perspective on how people with disabilities have lived, how they're currently living, and what we've learned, and what we can take forward. So super grateful for that. And just a couple of insights from me as I've been editing this podcast and reflecting upon it. And this concept of enlightened attentiveness, I think, is very important, and the challenge that Michael gives to us about really paying attention to that one individual that you are with. And to me, this is really about deep listening. Not only listening to words, if the individual has words, but looking at their expression, looking at their energy level when talking about a specific topic or area, looking at body language, looking at everything around that person, what you're feeling about how they are being in that moment. All of those things will give you clues, give you information into that individual, and to be there just in that moment, to be present with them, I think is all of those things encompass what it is to be or to have enlightened attentiveness. So as you think about how you could provide enlightened attentiveness to an individual, maybe consider some of those areas, or using all of your senses to be there for an individual and to pay attention. The other thing that I wanted to mention was around the topic of autonomy. And Michael talked about how we sometimes want to or have controlled an individual with a disability by making all of their decisions, or making a lot of their decisions, and taking that power away from them. And I was in a conversation with my sister, and I invited her over, and it was around dinner time, and she asked, "Are you going to make me dinner?" And it was one of those moments where I realized that that's something that she always has done for her, and she's never had the opportunity to really do that with someone, or do that on her own. So I said to her, I certainly won't make dinner for you, but I would love to make dinner with you. And I think that conversation with Michael around autonomy and making decisions for people rather than with people extends out further into how we support people. Are we doing things for people, or are we doing things with people? So I just wanted to share that brief little story with my sister, and how we could think about, are we doing for? Are we making decisions for? Are we doing tasks for? Or are we doing them with or alongside people? And when we do things for people, we take away their power, we take away their autonomy. When we do things with people, we are empowering them and giving them more opportunity to explore and to live life. So I hope those insights from me were somewhat beneficial, and I am grateful for you joining today on the podcast. In a couple of weeks, I'm not sure the guest that I'm going to bring you. I promise the conversation will be interesting, or at least I'm going to find it interesting, so I hope you will as well. So again, thanks for listening to the conversation today, and we'll talk to you soon. And thank you so much for listening to the podcast today. If you like this episode and you think you know someone that would benefit, please share it with them. Be a part of the change to think differently about disability.
Thanks for listening to today's podcast. Visit us at empoweringability.org for more podcasts and resources to help you and your loved ones impacted by disability build a full and meaningful life.